Hello and welcome to the Musicians Weekly, volume 34. I have a very good friend who is an anthroposophist or anthroposopher. I don't know what the word is in English. That means dedicated to the teachings of Rudolf Steiner, where we have the common practice of Waldorf schools worldwide that follow his pedagogic advices. And this friend, he tours around and gives lectures about anthroposophic composers. And he was in Munich and he spoke about the 4 composers around Rudolf Steiner. That is Adolf Aronson. He was a Jewish man who was basically not a musician, but who wrote some beautiful solemn music for some of the dramas that Steiner wrote, the mystery dramas. Then there was Leopold van der Pals. There were 3 Dutch composers then around him in Dornach in Switzerland. It was Leopold van der Pals and it was Jan van Stuten. And the 3rd composer, his name is Scherber. And why were there 3 Dutch composers around Steiner? Because Dutchmen were not forced to enlist as soldiers in First World War. And so they could stay in Switzerland and they could stay there and do all the things Steiner wanted them to do. So Jan van Stuten was the dominant person in Dornach and he was conducting the orchestra. They really had an orchestra there. And Scherber, he was the concertmaster. And Leopold van der Pals wrote some famous music for the so-called Overer Christmas plays. And these 3 were the main circle around Steiner. But there was definitely a hierarchy. So Leopold van der Pals was restrained and was not too interested in being there in a front position. Jan van Stuten took everything and had no doubt about himself, was totally convinced about his genius. And Scherber was opposing van Stuten and was a loser there. And so, but all of them are really now composers, where Anthroposophic Society calls them their own composers. And then there followed a lot of composers, and some were in touch with anthroposophy, like, for example, Johann Nepomuk David, the symphonist from Austria, who lived then in Germany, who taught in Stuttgart. Victor Ullmann, the fantastic composer who died in the concentration camp. Felix Peterek, also from Austria, who had met Steiner. And Fritz Büchtger, composer teaching in Munich. And there is one composer, Burkhardt, from German Democratic Republic. So everywhere there were some anthroposophic composers. And there are internationally, because anthroposophic schools, that means Waldorf schools, they really dedicate a lot of time to the arts. And even if it's not on a high level, they plant idealism into the souls of the pupils. They make them kind of self-thinking people, not so much going with the masses. And so there are a lot of people who, I always meet some people who went to a Waldorf school. When they are interesting people, many of them are from there. And even many people think that Waldorf school is nonsense and that it's too esoteric and all these things. I don't care, because finally we have the result. There are so many interesting people who come from there. But then the interesting fact is, the greatest composer who was ever among anthroposophists, he is not at all appreciated. That was a Nuremberg composer. His name is Martin Scherber. He was born in 1907 and he studied at the Munich Academy der Tonkunst. That's the today Musikhochschule in Munich. And he was a pupil of Gustav Geierhaas, who was also teacher of Heinrich Sutermeister, of Eugen Jochum, and of some others. He was kind of music after Max Reger but not so extremely chromatic, but very interesting music, by the way, and with very good counterpoint. So he really taught a good craft. And Scherber, he got all his craft, and then he became a conductor, and he went to Ústí nad Labem in Bohemia. At the time, the town had a German name, was conducting there 2 seasons or something like that, and then understood that this is nothing for him. He didn't become a musician to conduct operettas and all this entertaining, superficial music. And by the time he already had found Rudolf Steiner's writings and was a total follower of Steiner. Steiner was already dead. So he returned to Nuremberg and committed himself to the teachings of Steiner and to teaching music. So he had many local pupils, taught them playing the piano. I think also taught them playing the violin, if I'm right. But anyhow, music theory and about esoterics and about the way to live and all these things. And in 1938, he completed his first symphony. By the way, he had composed a lot in the 1920s and early 1930s, but at some stage, he thought that all this music is not worth, and he destroyed everything. Only a few piano songs survived because he had given them to a singer, and later in the things she left behind after her death, we found these songs. But everything else is erased from history. And so he started anew, and he wrote some choral music, some songs, but then he finished his first symphony in 1938. And this symphony is a symphony where all the 4 movements are put together in one large movement of a bit more than half an hour. And this first symphony is wonderful. It is, the language basically is from an era before. So it directly connects with Bruckner. But interestingly, the music is not like Bruckner. Many of its elements are Brucknerian. But the way he builds the form, the psychology of the form, the whole architecture is absolutely not Brucknerian. And very interesting modulation plan, which goes with the augmented triad. So we have the basic tonality, and we have the upper third, and we have the upper major third and the lower major third. And so we have a very interesting way of connecting harmonically. And this symphony, he had written it, and then came the war, and he was enlisted as soldier. He had to go somewhere, and then afterwards he was a prisoner of war. And he returned to Nuremberg. And when he had come back to Nuremberg, he studied the symphonies of Bruckner in detail, and he wrote piano scores of the symphonies number 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 of Bruckner, and also of the symphonic prologue by Max Reger. And this was his preparation for writing then in 1951-52 his second symphony, and in 1953-55 his third symphony. When the second symphony had been finished, the first was premiered by a conductor who had studied with Sergio Celibidache at the so-called International Music Institute in Berlin, which was founded after the war by Paul Höfer, Heinz Thiessen, and they had engaged Celibidache as professor for conducting, Tibor de Machula for cello playing, Siegfried Boris for violin playing, Höfer and Thiessen taught composition, and so on. And this pupil of Celibidache, his name was Fred Thürmer, and he was extremely gifted. And he was the only one I ever know about who got a fantastic testimonial from Celibidache, which really demonstrated to the world that he is a totally capable and first-rate conductor. And this Fred Thürmer was a fantastic case then for Scherber. So he conducted the premiere of his first symphony when the second was finished. And then Scherber finished the third in 1955. In 1957, in Nuremberg, in northern Germany, Fred Thürmer conducted the world premiere of the second symphony, which Scherber said should last around 1 hour. And then Fred Thürmer had no real orchestra anymore. Even Lüneburg was province. But then he went to Krefeld and he was conducting a chamber orchestra. And there was no opportunity to do this Scherber symphony. It was depressed Thürmer that he couldn't do so, but it was impossible. And so Scherber made a lot of investigation, of investment into writing to conductors, and he sent the score of his symphony everywhere. To Herbert von Karajan, to Bruno Walter, who wrote back to him that he doesn't understand how this music shall be real art, but it is real craft. And this was, of course, a very hard slash on Scherber. It made him really depressed. But he was convinced that the music is something special. He also sent it to David Oistrakh, and he thought that this kind of drushba, the Russian way of thinking friendship, worked with his music, because his music for himself was a symphony in the most social possible way. That means that every part is written in a way that it can satisfy the individual who plays that part. And for example, the wind players all have solos. Not only the first trumpet, also the second and third. Not only the first horn, all the four horns. And so on. All the woodwinds, all of them have important moments. Well, they are the leading voice in the orchestra. And so he thought about the symphony also as a social correlationship of all who are involved. And anyhow, it didn't work out. The symphony was never performed during his lifetime. And also the first and second symphony were never performed again. Over the years, he wrote also a set of piano pieces, all in all 31 pieces on the ABC, as he called it. That means all the letters of the alphabet, and even some more like O and I and so on. And he wrote 2 little trios for the 2 violins and piano, and a little bit of ritual music for anthroposophic use and such things. But not very much. He didn't write a 4th symphony because he wanted to hear his 3rd, and he never heard his 3rd. And so he was not motivated to write a 4th. There were some sketches, but he didn't do it. And he was mainly totally ignored. He only got these 2 performances of his first 2 symphonies in his lifetime. And so he was teaching privately at the Waldorf School in Nuremberg. And he had some very dedicated pupils. But the anthroposophic world ignored him. Even Bernson, who was a leading anthroposopher, said that this music shall be forbidden. It has no place in its time. And also some other anthroposophists were extremely negative about it. And they wanted to, at the time, they wanted to be modernists in a way. They were very fascinated by Stockhausen. They also had their relation with Wagner and Bruckner and all these things. But they wanted to be now in the avant-gardistic sense contemporary. And so there was no place for this extremely large fish in their little bassin. And so he never became better known among anthroposophists. Still today, these ABC pieces would be a fantastic thing for eurythmic training. But the eurythmists don't know it. They have no idea about this treasure that is there and is not in use at all. And so he was ignored there where he wanted to find some appreciation, and he was ignored everywhere else because he was totally fallen out of time. His style was not the thing of the day at all. And so in 1970, a drunken driver crashed and almost killed him on the street. And from there, he was a cripple and almost died, but then survived. But his health had harshly deteriorated, and he died in 1974. And his pupils were there, and they thought, what can we do? This music, they were convinced, is absolutely great, because there were recordings now of the symphonies, number 1, 2, and 3, of all the 3 symphonies, played by 2 pianists, by Martin Scherber and his pupil Willy Held, who has died a few years ago now. And so these documents were there. And so they thought that we have to do something. They accumulated money for projects. And finally, in the end of the 1990s, they decided, now we will bring out the symphony which has never been performed, the 3rd symphony. And they asked Elmer Lampson, who is an anthroposophist, composer and also bit conductor, to do the first recording of it. So it was recorded. They had 4 days with the State Philharmonic Orchestra of Rhineland-Pfalz in Ludwigshafen. And the recording came out, and people were fascinated, but they were a bit irritated also. It was a piece of 53 minutes, like just going through a tunnel. In a way, some were reminded of Alan Paterson, but totally tonal and very dark and with no obvious kind of form. What nobody knew at the time is that the symphony is with a very clear architecture. It has simply 12 sections, which are the signs of the Zodiac. And so, as this was not clear, it was just printed on CD in one large track of 53 minutes. Also, we have to know that these 53 minutes were an exact copy of the piano performance of Scherber and his pupil. But Scherber himself had said that the symphony is around 1 hour. And so 53 minutes is because the piano doesn't sound like an orchestra. So the piece was not really the piece. It was very interesting. It was also, for many people, some said it's just an unbearable anachronism, but it made no sense finally. During the 2000s, then the 2nd symphony came out with an orchestra in Moscow with conductor Samuel Friedman. And again, the case was that now it was 45 minutes. But Scherber said it's around an hour. But 45 minutes was the 2 piano performance. So much too fast. Played quite virtuosic by the orchestra. It sounds a bit like a friend of me said, like Russian ballad music. So, and then came finally Adriano, the Swiss conductor, and did the 1st symphony on CD. And this is still available on Sterling Records. And they asked me to write the booklet text at the time. And this 1st symphony, when Scherber had died in 1974, in the beginning of the year, just after his death, this 1st symphony was for the first time played again after the world premiere. One time again under Thürmer, and this is recorded, which helps of course a lot. And we don't have only a 2 piano performance, we have an orchestra performance by the conductor who worked very closely with Scherber. And the 2nd performance was Alexander Shumsky in the Waldorf School Engelberg with the Stuttgart Philharmonic Orchestra. Shumsky later became the music director of the University of Tübingen, a Romanian conductor. But then, again, total silence, no performances. Then the 3 recordings came. First the 3rd symphony, which had never been performed, then the 2nd, which had been premiered in 1957, and then the 1st, which had been premiered in the early 50s and had then been played again in 71 twice. Fred Thürmer was not anymore there. He died in his house. The house burned, and he burned inside the house. And he had a very tragic end, basically because he outed himself as homosexual. Nobody knew that before. And in Krefeld at the time, this was something like the most unacceptable sin an artist could have. Like Metropolis before that time in New York, and like some British musicians also. Okay, so Adriano had done the first, and then also the people who supported all these recordings with their money that they had accumulated over all the years after the death of Scherber, so for almost 30 years, and then 40, and then 50 years. These people, there was some who said, finally one was surviving. It was Friedemann Grau in Höchstadt near Erlangen, and he told me we should do it again. It was not the music it was not Scherber's music that was there on the record. It was something else, but not this. What I know, because he was the last piano pupil of Scherber. He knew how Scherber played on the piano. Also, when he showed him examples from the symphonies and all these things. And so finally he asked me to do it again, and we had a phenomenal orchestra in Tarragona, but finally we recorded it in Barcelona. So we did the world premiere of the Third Symphony by Martin Scherber. Now we called it the Zodiac. The title is not by Scherber, but the Zodiac signs are in the score. And we released this on Aldila Records. Now the symphony is not 53 minutes, it is 66 minutes. And it has 12 sections. And these sections are very clearly separated from each other, but everything grows out of everything, because it is what he called the Metamorphosis technique. So everything stems from one thematic cell. That's it. And from there, everything comes. This cell, the whole symphony is derived from. And then we have a real scherzo, which is the Cancer movement. And we have fascinating things in that piece, also formally. But I've written a large booklet text, and you can find everything inside it. And when you hear this, you can understand that Scherber was one of the greatest symphonists at all. Not everyone agrees. This symphony is, in a way, a more meditative approach to the symphonic form, cyclical, a bit like the cover. The orchestra is fantastic. It's at the time their name was Orchestra Sinfonica Camera Musica, founded and led by Tomás Grau, a very gifted conductor in Tarragona. And then Mr. Grau, the other Mr. Grau, the one who sponsored Friedemann Grau, he became very ill. He had cancer. And so he got the master of this recording, and it led him through the tunnel of death, he said, and he simply only survived by listening to the music day and night. And his cancer was that after he could leave the hospital, nobody knew whether he will survive. And so they said in the first year, many people die, but some survive. And then he told me he wants also to have the second symphony again. And so we did the second symphony again in Tarragona. The orchestra now had its new name, Franz Schubert Philharmonia. So the recording of world premiere and recording of the third symphony was in 2019, only 3 months before this Corona craziness. And we released on a double CD the studio recording from the day after the world premiere and the world premiere, which was in the better acoustics, and which is all in all maybe the performance I prefer, I must say. But of course, in the performance from the day after, some details are better. But basically, the live recording was phenomenal. So you will not notice very much that could maybe irritate you. I would say no, you will notice nothing that can irritate you. But anyhow, you are invited to listen to that. It is fantastic music. And I dare to say that for the first time, it is really there. Now, the second symphony we did in July 2024 in Tarragona. We had recording, and then finally we had a concert, open air, under the citadel of the Roman citadel of Tarragona, in an amphitheater. And it was very fascinating. It took 70 minutes. You think about that. The first recording took 45 minutes. No, the piece was 70 minutes, unfolded in 70 minutes. And the public was totally hypnotized by the music. And so we had a fantastic experience. Everybody, also the orchestra, like in the third symphony, they were totally convinced this is great music. This is unique music. I would say that the second symphony, which is much more dramatic and much more, has a kind of more obvious stringency in its development, that the second symphony is the final proof that Scherber is really the one who developed on what Bruckner had discovered. And it is, in a way, the music that could follow after the first movement of Symphony No. 9 by Anton Bruckner. It's absolutely phenomenal music. We are still waiting for the master, and the CD will be released in 2026. And it has a title where you could maybe be a bit doubtful. It is The Mystic Seven, the second symphony by Martin Scherber. Mystic Seven, why? Because Scherber said that the symphony has 7 sections, but he gave no indication where they are. So I had to find out myself. I must say I'm sure now, but a bit of a kind little doubt stays there, because when we have the 12 sections of Symphony No. 3, when you have written down where he wants the separation, or let's say where the next section begins, everything is totally organically connected and like a large carpet. But when if the indications would not be there, you could also decide, you could take some other decisions. It's not clear everywhere. In most cases, it's clear. Here starts a new section. But there are 2 or 3 times where you can be doubtful, and it could be also somewhere else. So we cannot be totally sure with the second symphony, but therefore the name is Mystic Seven. And this will come out next year, and this will be a real revelation, an incredible work with an absolutely cathartic climax. And yeah, it's a real wonder of one theme music. Everything derived from one theme, like in the Art of the Fugue by Johann Sebastian Bach. Different from Art of the Fugue, of course, is in this Metamorphosis technique that everything is in one movement, and that there are no fugues. So the second Scherber symphony, we are waiting for it, and I will let you know when it comes out. But for the moment, the third is there, and if you are interested, you can order it, and it's on Aldila Records, and it's a real masterwork in a style nobody would have expected in the mid of the 1950s, in the time when Boulez, Nono, Stockhausen, and so on were just the leaders of the avant-garde world. And so he would create another world at this time. And I would say in the most decisive and obvious sense possible. Martin Scherber, not even appreciated by his anthroposophic colleagues. And of course not appreciated by the world until now, but we hope we will change that. So I'm very happy if you subscribe to this channel, and maybe we get more momentum even then. And I thank you for listening and wish you a good time.